you believe in Bigfoot? Margaret didn't, until the day it saved her life. In the summer of 1991, deep in Washington's Gifford Pinchot National Forest, a 38-year-old forest worker slipped off a mossy ledge and was left dangling above a rocky creek, until a massive, silent figure pulled her to safety. But here's the shocking part. The creature wasn't aggressive. It was calm, almost protective. Bleeding from a falling rock meant for her, it let her treat its wounds. No snarls, no fear, just trust. Margaret wasn't just any hiker. She was a seasoned ranger who'd lost her husband in a climbing accident. She knew the forest. But this was something else. In the days that followed, she was guided through hidden trails, signs of life, nests, and stripped bark. And when it finally left her at a sunlit clearing, it stared at her, as if to say, "You're safe now." This video isn't about proving Bigfoot exists. It's about what Margaret found in that encounter: healing, connection, and a reason to let go of the past. She returned later with a camera, found prints, blood, even hair, but never shared it, out of respect. And that night, alone on her cabin porch, she whispered, "Thank you," into the woods. And from deep within, something answered. The air still carried the hush of rain when Maggie Hensley stepped off the trail and into the moss-heavy silence of Panther Creek's edge. Late summer light slanted through the canopy in shards of pale gold, but the forest hadn't yet shaken the weight of the storm. Water trickled from every fern, every needle, every rock. Her boots sank an inch into the softened earth, and she felt the shift of her own balance, familiar and unwelcome. She adjusted her pack, pulled the field notebook from its faded canvas pocket, and with a short pencil she'd sharpened against her own blade, scribbled a number down next to a hand-drawn tree marker. The page was damp where her thumb pressed. She turned, angled her body to get the slope in view, then froze. A breath, shallow. The edge was steeper than it looked. The slope dropped fast, coated in slick moss, stones loosened by the storm, roots half exposed like bones. Below, Panther Creek roared unseen, hidden by a thick curtain of cedar limbs and mist rising from the gorge. She narrowed her eyes, gauging the angle. Not much room for error. One bad step, and the mountain would swallow you. She crouched, laid a palm flat against a rock, glistening green with moisture. Her breath fogged in the cooling air. It had been 10 years since that climb in the North Cascades. 10 years since a sudden storm, a bad decision, and silence. Since the rope snapped. Since her husband's scream was buried by wind and then nothing at all. Since she learned what it meant to fall and not fall. All in one moment. Maggie blinked hard and stood. The ground didn't feel steady. She leaned forward, checked the next marker, then stepped. The world tipped. Her left boot slipped off a moss-slick stone, slid out from under her. The weight of her pack pulled her sideways. She twisted mid-air, hands grasping, boots scraping, heart slamming. She struck the slope with a wet thud and skidded. Her fingers clawed for anything, finding purchase on a narrow shelf of stone jutting from the slope like a last chance. Her right hand locked on, fingernails cracking, left arm dangling, boots kicking nothing but air. Below her, the roar of Panther Creek thundered up from the gorge. She dangled there, body twisted, the taste of iron in her mouth. Her ribs ached where the pack had slammed into her side. Her ankle throbbed with heat. Her hand slipped an inch. She gritted her teeth, gasped through clenched jaw. "Steady," she whispered. The words barely sound, only breath, like a memory spoken aloud to no one. Just breathe. The phrase wasn't hers. Not really. It had been his. 100 times on 100 trails, he'd said it when things got bad. When the ledge narrowed, when the wind rose, when the world tilted just so and reminded you it didn't care if you survived it. Just breathe. Maggie squeezed her eyes shut. The shelf was slick with algae. Her forearm trembled. Her foot searched for a brace and found none. Then a rustle, not the kind wind makes, heavier, deliberate, above her. She held her breath. Silence returned. Then a crack, soft, distant, like a branch snapped with care. Maggie dared a glance upward. The mist swirled above her, backlit by the dimming sun. Nothing, but something had moved. She wasn't alone. That she knew with a clarity so sharp it pushed the pain aside. Her instincts, once dulled by grief, now lit up like a flare. She braced, expecting. What? A bear? A cougar? Or worse, nothing at all. Just a slip, a scream, and the same vanishing act that had taken him. Her fingers cramped. She shifted, wincing. Her notebook had tumbled out during the fall, resting 10 feet below on a damp patch of moss. Useless now. The roar of the creek swelled, echoed in the canyon. Then came the smallest detail, tucked in the shadow of a rock outcropping just above her line of sight. A bundle of dry leaves, nestled where no wind could have blown them. Too neatly placed, too deliberate. And just above it, a branch, thick and green, snapped mid-shaft. Not where a person would reach, not even on tiptoe. Maggie's eyes traced the height, calculating. Not human, not likely. Her arms trembled again. She clenched her jaw, felt sweat gather at her temple despite the cool. The weight of the forest settled heavier now. It wasn't threatening. Not yet. But it was watching. Above she heard it again. 3 slow, heavy steps. Each one pressed with intention, as if the earth had to be reminded of the weight. Moss compressed. Stone shifted. The steps paused at the lip of the slope. And then, silence. No voice, no rescue call, no rush of boots down the trail. Just the forest holding its breath. The sun dropped behind the ridge and the light changed. Sudden, subdued, washed in gray and the ghost of gold. Maggie's fingers slipped another inch. Her breath grew shallow. Somewhere in her chest, panic began to hum. Then the sound came again, closer now. Not the crash of a predator, not the shuffling of something unsure. This was different, purposeful, measured. She felt it before she saw it, the pressure of presence. But the forest never showed you things when you expected them. It waited, and waited, and waited, until something stepped forward into that space between belief and proof, and changed everything. Maggie didn't scream. Not when the branch cracked again. Not when a shadow shifted across the ledge above. Not when a weight heavier than anything she'd ever felt leaned toward her. Because in that moment, something older than fear took hold. Not terror, recognition. Something was there, just beyond the edge, and it saw her, not as prey, but as someone holding on by her last good hand, too proud to call out, too stubborn to let go. And it stayed. The sky dimmed. The mist thickened. Water gurgled below, and somewhere above her, a being whose shape she could not yet name waited, silent, breathing, real. And so she held on and didn't look away. Even as the light fell into shadow, even as the world narrowed to the slick stone under her fingers, and the throb in her ankle and the breath in her throat, even as everything she knew about what belonged and what didn't began to unravel, stitch by stitch, because something, someone, was standing above her, waiting, and nothing would be the same after this. The moss was still wet from the storm, and the ledge beneath Maggie's hands had begun to ache with cold, leaching through the sleeves of her damp canvas jacket. Her arms shook now, not from fear, but from time, the way a body starts to go quiet when it's held too long in the same position. Her fingers ached from clenching. Her ankle had gone numb. The world beneath her pulsed with sound, with the rush of water, with the rhythm of a creek that had never once paused for any living thing. That same steady growl had filled her ears the night he fell. 10 years, and still, it returned like a ghost that refused to stay buried. But this time, something was different. Something was standing just above her. Not a ranger, not a passerby, not a man. She felt it before she saw it. The air went still in a way that didn't feel like weather, and she heard it breathe. It wasn't loud. It wasn't close. But it was there. And it was waiting. Her fingers slipped again. Another half-inch. The sound of her boots scuffing the stone startled her more than the drop below. She clenched harder, gritted her teeth, braced for the sound of her own fall. But what came instead was the slow shuffle of movement at the top of the ridge. Something enormous shifting weight from one foot to another. Not in haste, but in deliberation. Maggie didn't look up. She couldn't. She only listened. 3 more steps, then a pause. She thought she heard the breath again, closer this time. Then another shift of stone and something knelt, not fast, but slow. The way someone kneels who has nothing to prove. A shadow fell across her body, cutting the already dim light. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't a cloud. It was a figure. She dared one glance upward, and she saw a hand. It wasn't reaching yet, just hovering. Fingers longer than hers by half, dark with wet fur, streaked with streaks of green from the moss it had touched. The skin beneath looked thick, not quite human, not quite ape. Something older, something wilder. The knuckles were scarred, the nails short, and the palm faced her, waiting. Open, no demand, no threat, just the offer. Maggie didn't move. Her own body tightened, every instinct flaring. You don't reach for what you don't understand. You don't grab the hand of something that could end you. And yet, it hadn't. It was there. Still. Still as stone. Still as memory. Still as something that knew waiting was the first kind of mercy. She stared at it for what felt like a full minute. The cold crept deeper. Her right arm trembled. She wasn't going to make it on her own. Her pack was too heavy. Her leg was too weak. Her body had reached the edge. The very edge. She let go of the rock and reached up. Her hand found its place inside the palm. The skin was rough, warm, shockingly warm. It wrapped around her hand, not tight, not pulling, but sure. And then she rose, not fast, not jerked, just lifted, steadily, as if the earth itself had decided it wasn't her time. Her boots scraped the wall, skidded over damp stone, and then found ground. Real ground. Solid. She fell to her knees, panting, arms braced in the soil. Mud streaked her sleeves. Her pack sagged sideways. Her lungs burned. But she was up, alive, and the world was silent. Then the mountain moved again, not down below, but beside her. She looked up just in time to see the slope give way where she'd been hanging moments before. A whole section of moss and stone cracked loose, fell with a shudder, and vanished into the roar of Panther Creek. Debris flew upward in a burst, and for a moment she shielded her face. When the dust cleared, he was still there, standing now, towering, closer than before, and watching. He'd turned his back to the fall, shielded her. She saw the blood first, dark against the wet fur at his shoulder, already soaking into the moss along his back. No sound, no scream, no cry of pain, just stillness. Then the eyes met hers. She froze, not out of fear, not anymore. It was something else. The eyes weren't wild, they weren't empty, they weren't animal. They were calm, as if this happened all the time, as if he'd seen things worse than this. She didn't speak. There wasn't a word in any language that fit what this was. The world had too many names and not enough meaning. He didn't need her to explain. He only needed to know if she could stand. So she did. Slowly. Her ankle protested, her side ached, but she stood. Her breath came shallow, and she nodded. His head tilted, slow. Then he turned, limping slightly, but with balance like an old tree still rooted after the storm. He walked, just a few steps, then stopped, turned, waited. Not a command, not a call, just a pause, a question unspoken. Would she follow? The air held its breath again. Maggie's fingers flexed. She touched her ribs, winced, looked at the drop behind her, then forward, toward the figure half-shadowed by cedar branches and rain. Her foot lifted before her mind had even caught up. She took one step, then another, and the forest swallowed them both. Behind them, the edge where she'd hung was already shifting, crumbling further, pieces tumbling down to the creek that had seen everything and would tell no one. Ahead, only shadows, and the sound of something too large to name pushing gently through ferns and stone, never rushing, never looking back. Maggie limped, her boot dragged, her muscles screamed, but she moved forward, toward the thing that had not let her fall. Not yet, not today. And as the trees thickened, and the light dimmed again to the color of fading smoke, something in her chest shifted too, not healed, but breathing. The trail wasn't a trail. It was memory pressed into dirt by feet too old to belong to anything tame. A rhythm of passage carved into moss and fallen pine needles, bending between trunks that had stood long before maps and would likely outlast names. Maggie followed, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because she couldn't look back at the edge she'd nearly slipped from. Something in her body, tired, bruised, alive, knew forward was the only way out. He moved ahead, a shape more felt than seen, just far enough that she could choose not to be afraid. Every few steps, he paused to nudge a branch aside, clearing a place she could step, making no sound except the hush of fur brushing leaves and the soft thud of something that carried weight without aggression. She didn't speak. Her breath came out short, her ankle protesting every uneven patch, but she limped on. Once, she had to stop, leaning against the smooth side of a tree split in two by lightning long ago. Its center hollowed out, moss packed thick around the roots, and she could smell the memory of fire. She didn't ask if he'd stop too, but he did. He stood ahead, still as the tree line, one shoulder turned slightly toward her, as if he was listening to more than her footsteps. She took another breath, pushed off the tree, walked again. Not fast, not brave, just onward. When she slipped the second time, just a slide, not a fall. She grabbed hold of a rotten branch, and it cracked, dropping her hard onto her right knee. She gritted her teeth, hissed low through her breath. Pain bloomed behind her eyes. Before she could stand, she saw the shadow shift again, this time closer. She looked up. He didn't reach for her. He didn't step in. He crouched, just knelt there in the ferns, one hand touching the ground, waiting. There was something in the way he didn't interfere, as if he understood boundaries better than most people she'd met. As if he knew that dignity was a thing best left intact. She nodded once, pressed her palm into the moss, and got to her feet. He turned again, leading. They came to a place where the canopy broke, and a stream crossed the slope like a line of silver glass. She paused at the bank. The stones were slick. The current wasn't deep, but it moved fast over uneven footing. Her foot hesitated. Her balance wasn't what it had been. She looked at him. He stepped into the water, not all the way across, just to the middle. He turned, held out his arm, not toward her face or her body, but down low, palm up, wide wrist level with her hip. She didn't think. She took it. Not grabbed, touched, enough to steady. One step, two, then she was across. He let go the moment her boot found dry earth. She didn't thank him aloud, but something passed between them in that handoff. A shared understanding, neither soft nor sentimental, just real. When they reached the next rise, he slowed. His gait was uneven now, favoring the side where she'd seen the blood, the shoulder, the gash. She remembered the way he'd turned his back to the falling rock. She hadn't looked closely at the wound before. She hadn't dared. Now, with the forest dimming and the hush thickening, she saw the way he carried it. quietly, without complaint. She set her pack down. He stopped. She knelt, unzipped the side pocket, pulled out the red nylon pouch she always carried but had never really expected to use out here. Gauze, bandage roll, a small bottle of antiseptic she hadn't checked in years. She held it in both hands, let the items lie there, visible, then waited. He looked at her, not head on, from the side. Something in his breath slowed. Then he sat, just dropped to the ground beside her, knees bent, back turned. The wound was worse than she thought. Torn fur, skin open in a ragged gash from shoulder blade to upper back, dried blood matted in dark clumps. She reached, paused. "I'm sorry," she whispered, then pressed the alcohol-soaked pad to the edge of the wound. He flinched. A low sound came from his chest, not pain, not anger, just the kind of sound a living thing makes when it accepts what it cannot avoid. She worked quickly, not gently, but carefully. The blood was thick. The skin underneath was coarse, muscle dense and unfamiliar. She didn't speak again. She only wrapped, layer by layer, bandage circling what she could reach. Her hands moved with a kind of reverence she hadn't felt in years, like wrapping a tree limb broken by wind or setting a collarbone on a deer hit by a truck and still breathing. It felt strange, this closeness. Not wrong, just new. She sat back when it was done. He stood, didn't shake the bandage off, didn't pull away, just turned and began walking again, slower this time. She followed. They passed under a fallen pine that had split but stayed upright, forming an archway of sorts. Beyond it, the ground changed. Less trodden, softer, marked by a trail she wouldn't have noticed had she been alone. But now she saw it. The bend in the ferns. The way bark had been stripped in narrow bands, higher than a man could reach. A hollow tree with dry leaves tucked in high, too high. The scent changed, too. Not decay, not danger. Just old soil, damp wood. The musk of something that lived here and had long stopped trying to prove it. She paused again. Looked up. The sky was slipping toward late afternoon. The sun would drop soon. She should have been scared. Lost. Exhausted. But what she felt most was aware of her own breath, of the sound of his footfalls ahead, of the way the forest leaned in, not to trap, but to observe. They climbed another ridge, and from the top she saw a glint of light in the distance. Faint, like a gap in the trees where sky touched down. He stopped. She did too. No words, just that. The way two creatures might look at the same thing from very different stories and know they'd reached a threshold, and beyond it. Something waited. The underbrush thinned near the rise, and something in the light shifted. Not brighter, just clearer. The way air clears after something sacred passes through. Maggie's boots crunched against soil packed down by time, not people. The prints weren't obvious, not at first glance, but once your eyes adjusted to the rhythm of the forest, you saw them. The quiet disruptions, the softened paths, the bend of ferns never fully standing upright again. She followed him without knowing his name, because naming something this old felt arrogant. He didn't look back, didn't pause, but somehow moved as if he knew where her limits were and how not to press them. The wound she'd dressed earlier had started to soak through. A slow, dark stain spread into the white bandage, tracing the edge of his shoulder, and she wanted to speak, to ask if he needed rest. But the air held its hush, and she didn't dare break it. The sound of her breath and the occasional crunch beneath her were the only reminders she was human here. Everything else felt borrowed. At the base of the slope, beneath a half-fallen cedar blackened by lightning, the forest opened to something more than trail. The light there wasn't golden or soft. It was washed out, filtered through thin needles and hanging moss like breath held too long. He stopped. She did too. Just off to the left, Past a cluster of ferns taller than her waist, sat a hollow of earth lined in dry leaves. A nest, almost. Except it wasn't shaped like anything desperate or makeshift. It had symmetry. It had care. At the center lay the skeletal remains of a trout, clean picked, not broken. The head was intact, the spine whole, every rib still in place like it had been set down on purpose. Beside it lay strips of tree bark peeled into long, narrow curls, their texture stripped smooth by what must have been a hand, not claw, not tool, just repetition. Maggie stepped closer. Her boots barely made sound now. The smell in the clearing was rich, wet moss, turned earth, pine sap, a faint trace of wet fur. But nothing rotted, nothing unnatural. She crouched without thinking, brushing her fingers over the dry leaves. They'd been packed together in a way she remembered from wildlife dens. But this wasn't wild. This was lived in, thought out. She looked up. On the trunk of the tree behind the nest were vertical marks. Not scratches, not random, but purposeful scrapes, all at the same height, all worn down by touch. Someone had leaned there often. Someone big. Someone who'd made this place theirs. She stood slowly and turned her eyes toward him. He watched her from the edge of the space. Not entering, not looming, just there. Letting her see. Her breath caught. It wasn't about the nest. It wasn't even about the fish or the bark. It was what this all meant. He hadn't just saved her. He hadn't just passed through. He lived here, and not like an animal. Not like a myth. Like something between. A resident. A neighbor. She saw the lines now, stretching farther back into the trees. Smoothed bark, hollowed roots, piles of moss arranged higher than wind could throw them. There was order in the disorder, language in the silence, culture without sound. Maggie swallowed hard, felt the dryness in her throat. Her hand went to her side pocket, where the damp field notebook still pressed against her hip. She didn't take it out. Not yet. This wasn't for recording. Not yet. She took a step back, letting the hush return to the space. He shifted weight but didn't leave. The sun tried to break through the canopy again, but it only made it as far as the edge, throwing a thin line of light across the ground like a threshold. Maggie turned slowly in place, scanning the perimeter. A line of tree roots arched from the ground like frozen ribs, and beneath them, a patch of earth worn smooth and low, where something heavy had sat. Not once, many times. A resting place. She could almost see it. The shape of him curled in stillness, watching, breathing, being. Not hiding, just existing. There was no proof here for the world she'd come from, no signs, no hair samples in plastic bags, no grainy footage. Just space, just silence, just a life that had gone on without needing to be noticed. She took another breath. It felt different now. Deeper, like the first real breath in a long, long time. She looked at him again. His eyes didn't flinch, didn't blink. They just held her there, and in them she saw no fear, only patience, and something else. Permission. She nodded once, then turned her gaze forward. At the far end of the clearing, the trees began to part again. And in that distance, beyond where the sunlight cut down into the moss and the silence gathered into something almost warm, she saw it. An opening, a circle of light, too clean, too deliberate. A place kept clear not by fire, not by weather, but by will. He moved again, toward it, toward the space beyond. Maggie followed. Her foot caught once on a root, but she didn't stumble. Her pace had changed. The limp still there, but less sharp. Her shoulders no longer curled inward. Her hand stayed close to her side, as if guarding something. Not out of fear, out of respect. As they passed the edge of the clearing, the sound of the forest thinned. No birds, no wind, Just the occasional creak of a tree shifting weight in its own old bones, and the faintest rhythm of something larger exhaling far beyond sight. She didn't ask what came next. She didn't need to. Because the moment she crossed that boundary between moss and light, she knew she wasn't at the end of anything. She was at the edge of something else entirely. And she hadn't been invited. She'd been allowed. For now. The trees stepped back without warning, like something unseen had asked them to. Maggie blinked against the sudden change in light. The forest she'd been inside all this time had been one of shadows and breath, of damp earth and weightless silence. But now the edge of it cracked open and gave way to a clearing that didn't belong to any map she knew, and the first thing she noticed wasn't the space. It was the stillness inside it. A quiet so full it made her stop moving. Dust floated in the air, held mid-fall in golden shafts that spilled through gaps in the canopy overhead. The afternoon sun, lower now, had found a way to push through. Not violently, not loud, just present. She stood at the rim of that clearing like a girl at the edge of a sanctuary, one boot on moss, the other half raised. He was already there. She didn't see him walk in. He was just there now, standing full in the center of the light, so still he could have been carved from the trees themselves. His shoulders were massive. The curve of muscle beneath thick fur made him look more like a monument than something breathing. The bandage she'd wrapped around his shoulder had started to slip, stain through, edges dark and torn where it had rubbed against bark and weather. She thought it might fall off entirely, but it held, just barely. He didn't move. Not toward her, not away. Just stood, letting the light touch him, letting her see. And in that moment, there was no threat, no story, no world outside this exact breath. It was just the two of them in that golden hush, framed by air thick with dust and time. Maggie took a step forward, then another. She didn't rush. Her boots sank slightly into the soft moss at the edge of the clearing. She wasn't thinking about danger. She wasn't wondering what this meant. She was watching him. And he was watching her. But not in the way she knew from men or from predators. There was no challenge in it. No possessiveness. Just a long, level gaze. One that held a kind of knowledge she couldn't name. It wasn't human. But it wasn't wild either. It was something in between. Something ancient. Something intact. The look said what words never could. You are safe. Not forever. Not everywhere. But here. Now. She felt her chest ache. Not from fear. Not from her bruised ribs. But from the sudden, unfamiliar weight of being seen. Not watched. Not assessed. Seen. The kind of seeing that came with no judgment. Just notice. Just presence. It had been years. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Words would only bruise this moment. He turned his head just slightly, eyes scanning the treetops behind her, then back to her. Still calm. Still still. Maggie inhaled through her nose. The air was warmer in the clearing, scented with sap and sunlit moss. For the first time since the fall, she realized her breathing was even. Slow, like her body had finally come to believe it wasn't in danger anymore. She stepped closer, just inside the edge of light, and felt it on her skin. Soft warmth, not hot, just enough to remind her that she was still made of blood and bone and breath. He didn't flinch, didn't shift, just stood there as though part of the forest had peeled itself open to let him form inside it. Her eyes flicked down for the first time and caught a single thread of dark hair drifting toward the moss. It landed softly near her boot, catching a shimmer of light before it vanished into green. Her breath caught. She knew, without knowing how, that she wasn't meant to pick it up. Not yet, maybe not ever. It wasn't a gift, it wasn't evidence. It was something like a trace, a permission, Something had passed here, something had stood, something had chosen not to vanish right away, and that was enough. He began to move. Slowly. Not backward, not forward. Just to the side, fading into the deeper shadows where the light could no longer hold him. He didn't look away. He didn't run. He just turned into what he was again. A presence that belonged to the in-between. Maggie stayed where she was. She didn't follow. Something in her knew that would break the moment. Instead, she stood with her hands at her sides, her heart quiet, and let him go. The light held for a little longer, then dimmed. The dust stopped swirling. The clearing didn't close, but it began to settle. Like the air had released a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. Maggie turned, slowly, boots careful on the moss. She looked back once, but he was already gone. No sound, no echo. Just trees again, just sky, but different. She walked to the edge where sunlight met shadow and paused. Her foot touched a soft patch of green, and there, just at the border, lay a single dark strand of fur. She didn't touch it. She looked at it, long enough to remember where it had come from, then stepped past it. Not over, just beside, leaving it where it belonged. Her steps took her toward the line of trees again, but her shoulders were no longer braced against the unknown. Her jaw no longer tight. Her limbs, though tired, moved with the ease of someone whose body was no longer waiting for the worst. She passed under the branches. The light fell away behind her, and the forest closed in soft. She didn't rush. Her eyes adjusted quickly to the dim, and behind her, the clearing stayed. Empty, full, alive. She never said his name, never even tried to imagine one. What mattered had already been said, without a word, and whatever it had been, it would stay with her, not as a thing to hold, but a thing to remember, a thing that chose, just once, to let itself be seen, and then be gone. The rain had come and gone again by the time Maggie reached the cabin. It wasn't dark yet, but the kind of light that hung over Carson at that hour wasn't really light at all. More like the memory of sunlight that had already moved on. The gravel road was slick from the earlier storm, pitted with tiny puddles that reflected only sky. Not trees, not birds, just gray. She parked the truck a few feet off the porch and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Not gripping it, just touching. The drive back from the forest hadn't been long, but it felt like the distance between two lives. One that had always been hers, and one that would now never quite leave her. When she opened the door, the hinges groaned like they remembered her weight. The cabin didn't smell musty. It smelled like pine wood, old smoke, wet canvas, and the iron edge of a rusted kettle that hadn't been scrubbed in years. She didn't need to turn on the light. There wasn't one. The lantern on the shelf still had oil. The flint striker sparked on the first try, casting a warm amber haze across the old stove and the stack of note cards she'd left untouched for weeks. Nothing had moved in her absence. Nothing had been waiting. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot by the back wall and began unlacing her boots. Her hands moved automatically, fingertips scraped and raw from the climb, skin beneath the nails dark with moss. Her left ankle throbbed in time with her pulse. She peeled off the sock, wincing when the bruising came into view. She pressed 2 fingers against the swelling and flinched, then let out a long, slow breath. Nothing broken, just a sharp twist and a long way to heal. She wrapped the bandage tight, not too tight, then leaned back against the wood wall and listened. The cabin creaked once as it settled into its usual rhythm. Firewood leaned against the stone hearth, dry and ready. She struck another match, lit the stove, and fed it 3 small logs. The flames caught slowly, not in a rush, just enough to be steady. Her body relaxed a little with the warmth. Her ribs ached. Her shoulder stung from where she'd scraped it against a branch, but nothing bled. Not anymore. She moved to the shelf by the window, fingers trailing over the edge of the sill, picking up dust where none should have been. The old Pentax camera still hung from its nail by the frame. The leather strap cracked, the lens clouded from years of disuse. She touched it like it might disappear, then pulled her hand back. Instead, she reached for the notebook. It was warped now, from damp and pressure. The pages curled inward like they'd been trying to protect something. She opened to the last entry. Her own handwriting stared back at her, small, precise, more disciplined than it had any right to be. No emotion, just markers, boundaries, coordinates. She flipped to the next page and found it blank. She picked up the pencil from the table, stared for a while. Then she wrote, not a name, not a date, just a sentence that had been living in her bones since the fall. If you can't save the mountain, save the one who's slipping. Her hand trembled slightly. She set the pencil down, closed the notebook, didn't look back at the page. The fire popped, a soft crack that reminded her of that branch high above Panther Creek, the one that snapped when the stones gave way. She closed her eyes, not tightly, just enough to hold the image. His back turned to the fall, his shoulder bleeding quietly, his silence, his stillness, his presence. She could still feel the size of him standing in that clearing, wrapped in golden dust and light too honest to explain. Not a beast, not a miracle, just there, and that was more than enough. She got up, limping only slightly now, and placed the kettle on the stove. The hiss of water meeting iron sounded louder than it should. She didn't mind. She turned to the tiny wooden counter, unwrapped a tea bag from the chipped tin, and dropped it into a clay mug that had a crack running down one side. She filled it halfway. Sat down again. She sipped in silence. The warmth spread slow. Out the window, dusk had begun to press its shoulder against the glass. Shadows moved along the trees in long streaks. Nothing passed through them. No birds, no deer, no wind. Just the shift of evening pulling the day into itself. Her eyes wandered back to the camera. She hadn't used it in years. Not since the accident. She remembered the day her husband gave it to her. How he'd said it was for moments they'd forget if they didn't catch them right. She hadn't believed him then, but maybe he'd known something she didn't. That some moments don't need capturing. They just need surviving. She pulled the quilt from the end of the cot, wrapped it around her shoulders, and let herself lean into the wall again. The fire had dropped to coals now. The mug was nearly empty. The wind picked up once, then quieted. She didn't feel alone, not like before. Not like those nights when even the trees felt like strangers, and her own hand seemed too far away to belong to her. Tonight, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of something soft, like a held promise, like a space being made. She touched her ribs again, where the ache had begun to settle, then her chest. Then let her hand fall to the quilt. The air smelled faintly of cedar. Her head tilted toward the window, toward the dark outline of the hills. And somewhere out there, beyond the porch, beyond the dirt road and the trees and the last rise where the creek bent west, something waited, not to be found, not to be proven, just to be remembered. And Maggie Hensley, with her bruised ankle and her weathered notebook and her mug nearly dry, sat still in that cabin in Carson and wrote nothing more, because there were no words left that didn't sound too small, only breath, only heat, only memory, and the quiet hum of a fire that would burn just long enough to last till morning. The sun was already high when Maggie returned to Panther Creek, but the light didn't feel warm. It had that washed-out sharpness only cloudless skies could carry. The kind that made everything beneath it look a little too clear, too quiet, like the forest itself had been scrubbed of its usual shadows. The trail hadn't changed, but she had. She parked farther back this time, near the bend where the gravel softened into pine needles. She didn't carry much, just the old Pentax slung around her neck, her notebook tucked in the chest pocket of her coat, and a hiking stick she'd cut and whittled herself a week earlier. Her ankle was almost back to normal. The bandage was gone, but she still felt a tug in the joint when the incline steepened. That part didn't bother her. Some things were meant to leave a mark. She followed the same slope where her body had once dangled from the moss-slick ledge. Every footfall sent a memory chasing up her spine. The scuffed rock face, the sound of her own breath echoing in her ears, the weight of air before the hand appeared. She didn't linger. She kept moving, slow but steady, until she reached the upper edge of the ridge, the place where her field notebook had fallen, where the earth had crumbled beneath her, where something else had chosen to stand still and shield her with its own body. The stones were dry now. The moss browned around the edges from late summer sun. But when she stepped closer, she saw it. A patch of blood, not red anymore. Dark, stained into the stone like oil. A dry spread of memory pressed flat where nothing had grown back. She crouched beside it, fingertips hovering just above the edge. She didn't touch. She only looked. The shape of it was jagged but unmistakable, and just beside it, half hidden beneath the edge of a fern, lay something that hadn't been there before, a strand of fur. Not loose like something shed. It had caught on something, maybe a thorn, maybe a rock. Dark brown, almost black, thicker than hair, coarser. Maggie picked it up between her fingers. It wasn't light. It had weight. Texture. She turned it slowly, letting the sun catch it. Then she reached into her jacket and pulled out the wax paper she'd folded days ago, unwrapped it carefully, and placed the strand inside. But she didn't fold it shut. Not yet. She stood and followed the curve of the ridge, careful where the rocks narrowed. She knew where the next marker would be before she saw it. And there it was. A footprint. Not boot tread, not shoe. Bare, wide, deep, pressed into a pocket of wet earth where the slope curved inward and the drainage pooled. Maggie stepped back instinctively, not out of fear, but respect. The print was longer than her own foot by a third, with toes that flared wider, the heel sunk deep. Too deep for someone who hadn't weighed hundreds of pounds. She looked around. No others. Just this one, singular, intentional, a sign of movement, or maybe a choice. She raised the Pentax, brought it to her eye. The lens was foggy from storage. She wiped it clean, framed the shot, focused, paused, then lowered it. She didn't press the shutter. The camera hung from her neck again, swinging slightly as she crouched by the print. She took the wax paper from her coat, the strand of fur still resting inside. For a moment her hands hovered. Then she leaned forward and placed the strand gently at the edge of the footprint. Not hidden, not obvious, just returned. She folded the wax paper in on itself and tucked it back into her coat, now empty. Her eyes scanned the tree line. Everything still, nothing moved. But the air had changed, the way it did when someone steps out of the room, or steps back in. She stood, using the hiking stick to steady herself, and turned in a slow circle, letting the forest speak whatever it needed to. There were no sounds, except the breeze brushing the tops of the cedars. No voices. But the sense of being watched wasn't unsettling. It felt like being witnessed. Maggie pressed her palm against her chest. The rhythm there had slowed, calmed. She breathed in and let it settle. And then a branch, high, moved. Not wind. Too slow. Too separate. Too deliberate. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Some things were better left unsaid. Better left unwritten. Better left exactly as they were. She took one final glance at the stone. The blood-stained memory. The place where silence had once stepped forward and chosen her. Then turned and walked back the way she came. Her boots made almost no sound now. Even the birds seemed to quiet in her wake. At the edge of the slope, just before the trail dipped again, the creek murmured louder. She paused. A shift in water, like something large had stepped in and out without leaving a ripple. She didn't check. She didn't need a goodbye. What they'd shared wasn't the kind of thing you close with words. It was something quieter, harder, a promise kept. She touched the camera once, not to use it, just to remember she hadn't, and kept walking. Behind her, the moss returned to silence, and the forest watched without asking for anything more. The day had folded into blue when Maggie stepped out onto the porch. Not blue like the sky in spring, but the deeper blue that belongs to late summer evenings, when the heat has finally loosened its grip and the earth starts to exhale. The boards beneath her boots creaked in that familiar way, soft and worn like an old voice clearing its throat. The cabin behind her was quiet. The fire had gone out hours ago. The tea had gone cold, but she hadn't moved until now. She stood there, hands wrapped around a chipped mug she didn't plan to sip from again, eyes fixed on the line of trees in the distance, the ones that crowned the ridge like old watchmen. Carson was silent. Even the wind had given up trying to rustle the needles tonight. It just breathed low, skimming the tops of the pines like it was trying not to wake anything. Her breath clouded slightly, then vanished. Her fingers curled around the mug's curve once, then loosened. She set it down on the railing and let her hand rest flat on the wood. "Thank you," she said. Not loudly, just into the air, into the dark, into the place where silence used to be. There was no reply. Not at first, just the hush of everything holding still. She lowered her head, let her shoulders sag. It wasn't the kind of weight you could name, just the kind that settles in slowly after something sacred passes through you and leaves you a little more hollow than before. Not broken, just emptied out, so something else can fill the space. And then it came. Not a word. Not a sound made by human throat or creature's cry, just a low, deep thrum, carried from somewhere far off in the folds of the valley. One long note, like a stone dropped in the deepest part of the gorge, echoing off walls that hadn't heard a voice in years. She didn't lift her head. She didn't need to. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a call. It was a presence. A way of saying, "I heard you. That's enough." Her throat tightened. Tears came without shame. They weren't grief. Not this time. They were something else. Relief. The kind that breaks through after years of pretending not to miss what you've lost. She blinked them away. Not to hide them, but to see clearer. Her hand reached up slowly, brushed her cheek, then returned to the railing. The trees hadn't moved. The stars hadn't come yet, but something had shifted. Inside, around, between. She stepped back into the cabin, quiet as a tide returning to shore. The lantern cast a soft circle on the table, the flame near gone. Her notebook still lay where she'd left it, spine cracked open, the last page waiting. She didn't sit. She just stood there, one hand on the chair, the other flipping to the back. She pulled the pencil from the cup. Wrote 6 words, "I won't trade wonder for proof." Then she closed it, pressed the cover flat, and let it be. No signature, no ending. Just that. She didn't need anyone to read it. The kettle clicked as it cooled. The coals had gone dark. A draft pushed through the seam in the door and caught the edge of a map pinned to the wall. It fluttered once, stilled. Maggie reached up, thumbed the frame of the old pentax still hanging from its nail. She didn't take it down. She didn't need to. That story wasn't going to be told that way. Not for the world, not for books, just for memory, just for her. She walked to the window and looked out again. The ridgeline hadn't moved, but something on its edge had shifted. A shadow, maybe, or a figure, or nothing at all. It didn't come closer, it didn't wave. It just stood, then faded, not hidden, just gone. She didn't watch it vanish. She only stood there, feeling the space where it had been. The wind picked up again, a little louder now, like it had been holding its breath this whole time. She breathed in, let it out slow. The night held. No dogs barked. No trucks passed on the gravel. No birds called from the trees. Only that quiet, pulsing sense that the forest wasn't far, that it had never really been far. That some things, when they choose to step forward, don't need to stay to be felt. They just leave a shape behind, in the light, in the sound, in the body. She touched her chest again, felt the rhythm there, steady, familiar, new. Outside, the dark had settled fully, and in it, nothing watched. But something listened, and far off, just beyond the ridge, something stood guard, not to be seen, not to be found, just to be remembered. And the cabin in Carson, lit by nothing but the memory of flame and the echo of something too sacred to hold, stood still in the quiet, alive, listening, and, for the first time in years, at peace. Sometimes the most powerful moments in life happen far from the noise. Not in cities, not in crowds, but in the quiet places. The ones where breath slows, where time stops running, and something ancient starts to speak again. Not in words, but in presence. And if we're still enough, if we're open, we might just hear it. There's a kind of understanding that can't be taught. The kind that doesn't come from answers or proof or being right. It comes from witnessing, from standing on the edge of the known, looking into the unspoken, and choosing, without fear, to feel it anyway. The truth is, not everything in this world is meant to be captured, explained, or brought home. Some things exist simply to remind us that wonder still lives out there, breathing beside us, just beyond the tree line. Some things come into our lives to open something long shut. Not to change us, but to remind us that we're still capable of change, that we're still capable of awe, of stillness, of compassion, even toward the unknown. There is strength in silence. There is meaning in mystery. And there is something deeply human in the decision to protect what is fragile simply because it is. No reward, no applause, just the quiet knowledge that kindness is never wasted, that reverence is a choice, and that sometimes the most important promises are the ones no one ever hears. So if you've carried something with you through this story, a memory, a question, a feeling that caught you off guard, let it stay with you a while. Let it settle. Not everything has to be named to be real. Some truths don't need a headline. They just need a heartbeat. And if, somewhere deep down, this story reminded you that the world still holds space for the sacred, for the things we cannot own, cannot tame, but can choose to honor, then maybe that's enough. Thank you for walking into the quiet with us. If this story touched you in any way, we'd love to know. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what stayed with you. And if you'd like to be part of more stories like this, ones that carry a little mystery, a little warmth, and a whole lot of heart, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. We'll be here, waiting, somewhere out past the edge of the known, listening,